tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
Let's start with something that can unite us all, beer. Now, my friend Grant Dingwall has been in the trenches on this fight for many, many years now. He founded some years back a campaign called Free My Booze, which, as the name suggests, is the noble calling. It's not a call for free booze, but it's a call for liberated booze, letting alcohol be sold in convenience stores, beer and wine. And in the Ontario context, the beer store has this massive, massive oligopolist effect that has disadvantaged consumers in more ways. Well, my friend Grant is finally getting what he wants. Premier Doug Ford has expedited the long-planned rollout of beer and wine to convenience stores. So I figured we'd have Grant on to talk about this. Good to talk to you, sir. Thanks for coming on today.
Thanks so much for having me on.
So let's explain for non-Ontarians, first off, what the heck is the beer store and why has it had such an outsized influence in the retail market?
Yeah, so basically in 1927, Ontario ditches prohibition. The government says, we don't know what to do with beer. What do we do with this new market? And they called on the brewers in Ontario at the time to start a store. And they said, you guys can sell beer, we'll sell liquor. That's how we'll deal with it. And as time went on, those brewers didn't let new brewers in. They kept ownership themselves. And those brewers were more and more successful. They brought, they sort of gained their stranglehold stronger and stronger. Eventually, they all got sold to foreign multinational interests. And then, here we were in the 2000s with a store that was owned by 3 multinational breweries. And it had the unique privileges to sell beer to consumers in Ontario. Even privileges over the LCBO. So they were allowed to sell 6-packs and 24-packs, but the government-run liquor stores weren't allowed to sell those because the beer store had unique privileges.
Whenever the topic of the LCBO and the beer store have come up, what's always astonished me is that the arguments in favor of them are just so terrible and they're so fictitious. Like the LCBO believes that if you let anyone else sell alcohol, babies are going to be walking around with bottles of whiskey and people are going to be getting into car accidents and drunk driving is going to go through the roof. Like to use, Pierre Poilievre's language of the gatekeepers, these are people that believe that they must be the gatekeepers of alcohol. Otherwise, all hell will break loose. And I've yet to hear a legitimate defense of these things.
I mean, there isn't one, right? This is how beer is sold everywhere in the world outside a handful of U.S. states and a handful of Canadian provinces. I guess to finish the history lesson, because I think it's instructive in that respect, in 2012 to 2015, sort of in that period, it came out that the Ontario government had signed this hidden deal with the beer store, and the details of that deal got out, and pressure got put on the Ontario government to do something. So what they did was they signed a 10-year deal with the beer store in 2015 that dictated the terms publicly. So basically, they brought it out of the shadows. They said, the hidden deal is no more. Here's a new deal that we're signing for 10 years. And as part of that deal, we got beer and wine in 300 grocery stores in Ontario. No convenience stores. Those were still taboo. But we got it in 300 grocery stores and later 450. But that sort of killed the moral argument, right? Like, if these 300 grocery stores are acceptable by the moral police, then why not the other 3,000 grocery stores that existed in Ontario, right? Why are these 10% good and the other 3,000 bad? And they never had an answer to that. And that's what put the writing on the wall, right? That we were eventually going to be successful because the status quo was so nonsensical at that point. They'd given up their moral argument. So now what?
I haven't looked at the comments on YouTube, which generally speaking carries some risks if you do. But when I've talked about this issue in the past, it's not uncommon to get some variation of, sure, there are bigger issues to talk about. Why are you wasting time on this? And I've never liked that because you can walk and chew gum as a government and as a media enterprise. I mean, you have to be able to talk about, war in the Middle East, and you have to be able to talk about the little things that affect people. But why does this matter?
So for me, it just mattered because it was so profoundly stupid, right? Like I was 25 and I was bored when I launched Free My Booze, but it was, for me, it was a sign of government overreach and government stupidity that was just so in our face every day. You know, before we launched Free My Booze, before the reform started rolling out, you were unable to buy beer at 6 p.m. on a Sunday anywhere in the province. There wasn't a single place in this province where you could go and buy a beer at 6:01 p.m. to take home. And you know, in the middle of summer, it's broad daylight. You know, it's like, but we had all these holdovers from the past, and they were just like annoying for no reason. There was no justification. We were needlessly inconveniencing consumers, needlessly inconveniencing businesses. You know, holding back economic growth for what, right? So it was just a sign of how stupid things were, and it was something that I thought we could win if I put my effort into it. So
now, I know that the criticism coming from these newfound fiscal hawks in the NDP and the Liberals in Ontario are that, you know, this is going to cost $225 million to do what Doug Ford is doing here. What's your make on that? Because they've basically expedited it, and there is a cost to that.
Yeah. So look, I mean, Ford is doing kind of what I want, but not how I want it, right? And that's been true every step of the way on this. Unfortunately, I don't get to write all government policy. I wish I did. I'm sure you can share that misery. But look, from my opinion, I think when Ford came in, he should have just signed legislation that killed the deal. There was people that didn't want to do that because they said it's a bad sign to business, you know, for the government to renege on its deals. I was of the opinion that deals that are signed in bad faith that have no benefit to anyone in the province don't have a reason to exist. But they didn't do it. They decided to negotiate with the beer store. They decided they wanted to work within the legislation, work within the law rather than change the law. So that meant we had to wait until 2026 originally. And now they've gone back and negotiated further and said, we're going to move this ahead. But unfortunately, you know, negotiating with a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate has a price. And that price is going to be apparently $225 million. The NDP and Liberals are sort of claiming that there's additional costs. They're like, oh, well, the wholesale discount is another giveaway to these corporations. And I think most of that is nonsense. I mean, wholesale pricing exists in every industry. Of course, it's going to exist in alcohol. So they keep trying to throw this $1 billion figure around, and I've looked at those numbers, and I don't think they hold up. But yeah, there is the cost of $225 million, and that's because Kathleen Wynne, the Liberal Premier, signed a 10-year deal to, excuse the language, to screw us for 10 years, and Ford wants to get out of it early. That's where we're at.
Yeah, and I think it needs to be pushed back at them. So yeah, well, this only happens because of your party and what your party did. So this idea that all of a sudden the Ontario Liberal Party cares about government spending is delightfully quaint for anyone who was around during the Dalton McGuinty, Kathleen Wynne era. Well, I know you've been plugging away at this for a while, so congratulations on the Wynne grant. Appreciate your time today.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.